We go ahead and get started. Can you just confirm?
Yes, we're good to go.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Julia Matevosyan. I'm a chief engineer at ESIG. ESIG also serves in a leadership role for Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or G-PST. The mission of G-PST is to bring together key actors and catalyze rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scale and speed. This is being done by providing coordinated and holistic approach to the necessary knowledge, education, and support of power system operators across 5 actions pillars. The foundation of G-PST is a group of 6 system operators, from which you'll hear from one of these today. So these 6 system operators around the globe are facing higher penetration of wind and solar and water-based resources, and sooner than any other operators in the world, they're going to reach really high percentages. The 5 pillars of consortium are research, peer learning, technical support, task force development, workforce development, technology adoption support, and open data and tools. And ESIG leads pillar 1, which is research agenda. For more information on Global Power System Transformation Consortium, you can go to www.globalpst.org. As the lead of Pillar 1, ESIG would like to welcome you to this October monthly webinar of our joint G-PST Pillar 1 and ESIG webinar series. This series is in addition to regular ESIG monthly webinar series and focuses on Global Power System Transformation Consortium's agenda items. Topics presented by both founding system operators and other advanced system operators active in Pillar 1, as well as members of industry and academia participating in activities of the Research Agenda Group and Research Advisory Committee of Pillar 1 at G-PST. An additional series of webinars on other 4 pillars of the G-PST is also being provided on a monthly basis through a National Renewable Energy Lab. For those of you who would like to learn more about G-PST and how to engage, please go to www.globalpst.org and click on Get Involved tab. And further information on ESIG can be found on www.esig.energy. So next, I would like to go over some logistical matters for this webinar. First of all, the phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid any unnecessary distraction. For the Q&A, we'll use Slido platform as always, so go to slido.com. You need to open browser window in slido.com and enter ESIG 19 as an event code. So it's ESIG 19 as an event code, and I believe you are seeing it on your screen right now. We plan to save about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email will go out with a link once the video has been posted. And we also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your question through Slido, even if you see really a lot of questions there. Today we have a webinar that is going to cover advances in the use of wind and solar forecasting. Certainly this is very important and timely topic with growing shares of wind and solar that we're experiencing around the world. Today's webinar will feature Amber Motley. She's a director of short-term forecasting at California Independent System Operator. In her current role, Amber is accountable for leading a team to perform daily forecasting responsibilities for the California ISO and participating energy imbalance market entities. This also includes advancing formulation of CAISO's reserve requirements and integrating probabilistic forecasting into the market optimization. Prior to joining CAISO, Amber worked for Excel Energy Services, first as a trader analyst and later as a manager in market operations. So in today's webinar, she'll focus on importance of renewable energy forecasting to grid operations with high penetration of renewable resources. The webinar will address optimization of forecasts from multiple renewable providers and the evaluation and evolution towards new renewable resource types of co-located and hybrid resources. So this includes the additional data requirements for hybrid and co-located resources and the use of confidence bands for probabilistic renewable forecasts in planning day ahead and future time horizons to ensure uncertainty of these resources is accounted for in system reliability considerations. As a short reminder, once again, go to Slido at slido.com. With the event code ESIG 19, so it's ESIG 19, and ask your questions. And without any further ado, Amber, the floor is yours. Go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you guys for having me today. I'm always excited to talk about the forecasting that the California ISO is doing. And it's been a while since I've talked on the renewable side of the house. I think you guys have seen me talking a lot about the uncertainty requirements that are out there. I'll touch on them just a little bit today because we are talking about probabilistic forecasting. So of course they come along with. But today I really wanted to focus on the advances in the use of wind and solar forecasting. Where is the CAISO using wind and solar forecasting over time? One of the things I wanted to start with is a little bit of a history about renewable forecasting for those that have been around for a while. They'll get a laugh out of this, and then for those that are new to this, where it started and really how far it's come in a pretty rapid period of time when you look at it in the scale of things. And then I'm going to dive into the CAISO processes of wind and solar forecasting and really talk about how we're using probabilistic forecasts to either form confidence bands or use them in other products. And then really the other thing that we've been seeing is when you have a rapid number of renewable resources on the system, you have to have redundancy. And with that redundancy also comes an optimization of multiple renewable providers to make sure you have the best forecast going downstream. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then about the two new resource types that we've had come on in the last few years, the co-located and hybrid resources, and then the new data requirements that came along with them and why those data requirements were important to be developed. With that, I'll dive in. For many of you guys are aware, California ISO is in the Western United States. We are a federal regulated nonprofit organization, and we manage the high voltage electric grid throughout the West. In the CAISO BAA, we manage the day ahead as well as real-time optimization, which covers 80% of California and a sliver of Nevada. But we also operate the Western Energy Imbalance Market that's throughout the West in the orange in the real time, and the forecasting team does provide uncertainty requirements as well as load forecasts for those regions. We hit our all-time record peak last year on September 6th at 52,061 megawatts. I will note the previous record before that was in 2006, and it was 50,000 megawatts and some change. So we added in a peak about 2,000 megawatts last year. And so where did it all start? So back in the day, I don't want to date myself, back in the day, I remember coming to be like, we need to forecast some wind farms. And wind started coming on first. You'll see this is some of the wind farms that were developed in the Alta Pass in the 1980s, some of the oldest wind farms in the United States and even in the world. And when it came to the forecasters of the energy side, it was, we need to forecast these wind farms. And I remember them giving us an area, and our first question is, well, do we have an address? Do we know the address of where these wind farms are to start forecasting for them? And that really started off the advances in renewable forecasting. And one of the things that you saw is it really required multiple efforts to start getting data requirements. Data requirements being, where are you? What is your address? Like, what is the topographic map that is around you, so we can help understand, you know, the prevailing wind direction. CAISO put into place the participating intermittent resources in about 2003. And then there was a big effort to get more data requirements, more renewable forecasting requirements with FERC 764, which came out in 2014. And then recently, you have two new resource types come on, which are the hybrid and co-located resource changes for CAISO. Those came into effect in 2021 through 2023, and I'll get into those more towards the end of the presentation. But these data requirements were really critical to making sure that we could start advancing the renewable forecasting. So you were getting information of the location, you were having requirements of how many meteorological stations needed to exist at the renewable site, the generation capacity, how big are you, and the different limits they have. You'll see over here, do you have a cold weather package? Do you have a hot weather package? When do you cut out on temperature? How high are you? Where's the hub height of your facility? All of those different specifications really were critical to starting to advance more renewable forecasting expertise, especially as you take the weather information and you get into the megawatt output. There's many collaborating partners, so this is not just the ones that were in the collaborations throughout this time. I just wanted to put a few up there to just say that it really takes multiple of us in collaboration to get to the output. So you saw NOAA there. Some of the things that they were doing on their side is really putting different variables within the numerical weather prediction models that were very specific to renewable forecasting. And then further down the line, you saw them putting variables in that really helped with solar forecasting, and the HER being one of them with smoke, right? And really meeting those needs, that collaboration is really important. You have the national labs, all of the national labs really helped advance the overall structure of renewable forecasting, trialing different things, trialing different turbines and technologies, the state coordinations, and then the coordination with the Department of Energy. There were a number of funding opportunities, research opportunities that really help advance each of the different forecasting techniques that are there. So here's a timeline that is only going to 2019. I will talk later about some of the stuff that has happened since 2019, but you see that on 5/1 of 2014, that's when FERC 764 implementation started for the California ISO, and that's when we had our first forecast service provider, which I'll refer to for the rest of the presentation as an FSP, start forecasting for the California ISO. Fast forward a little bit, we found it in 2017 that it was really critical. There was a lot of developments during that period of time. There was also a large increase in the renewable resources on the system, especially the growth of solar resources during that time, that we released a new request for proposal, a new RFP. One of the things that came out of that RFP was a multiple forecast providers moving into production. So as of July of 2018, we implemented 2 renewable forecast providers for both wind and solar, for both of the horizons of all the forward day ahead, as well as in real time into production to be able to cross-optimize and perform redundancy features when needed. The other thing that was happening on the bottom side during that period of time is in-house we were developing what we call the persistence forecast. It's implemented internally to the California ISO. It's implemented with our market system, and it is used for all of the binding and advisory intervals in the real-time dispatch, or what we refer to as RTD. That time frame is about 10 minutes. The market runs about 10 minutes prior to actual. So we implemented it in 2018. We performed some enhancements to it from the time it implemented in April to October, where we saw some things that we could really work to improve, especially on the switch logic that I'll talk about a little bit more. And then lastly, we started implementing it not just for the CAISO BAA resources, but we've implemented the persistent forecasting for the EIM and the Western Energy Imbalance entities for both wind and solar resources. Since then, we have now implemented hybrid and co-located resources in the 2020 timeframe, and some more data elements as well. So a little bit of facts. How big of renewables do we have on the system for California ISO right now? So right now, we have about 509 renewable resources on the system, and they total, and this is CAISO BAA stats now, They total about 26,000 megawatts of capacity in total of both wind and solar. On the solar side, we're at about 17,000 megawatts of solar, which you can see by the peak that's up at the top. And then on the capacity of rooftop solar, which is also a renewable resource, we have about 14,500 megawatts of rooftop solar on the system. We've hit some new solar peaks. We have a lot of solar energy that's coming onto the system right now as we near the year end. So we actually hit our all-time solar peak in September, on September 6th of 16,044 megawatts. We've been hitting that pretty consistently throughout the year because new resources have come online. Our typical time to hit peaks, if we weren't growing on the renewable side for solar, would be in the May, June timeframe. For wind, we have about a little over 7,000 megawatts of wind on the system. So our all-time peak was last year in May at 64,065 megawatts. We have seen that at times peak percentage of renewables compared to the demand that's on the system has gone over 100%. Our record is set at 103.5% on May 8th of 2022. And as we get towards the end of the slide deck, I'll show what the resource mix looks like for one of those high penetration renewable days. I won't read everything on this graph because there's a lot, but I want to highlight just a few things of the overall process of the wind and solar forecasting at the California ISO. So like we talked about earlier, it all starts with the data, right? So you need to know, what are you? Where are you? How big are you? What are your operating parameters? What's your model technology? Because you ultimately have to take that meteorological information, transmit it into power information. You have to incorporate outages and derate schedules. There's also renewable dispatches that are happening, whether those be market instructions, curtailments, operating instructions. Those are all critical information that has to be fed and monitored when you're developing a forecast. In addition to that, we now have two types of telemetry, and I'll put the second one in quotes a little bit. So we have real-time generation telemetry. We know, for each one of these resource IDs, how many megawatts in every 4 seconds they're putting onto the grid. And as of the hybrid and co-located initiative go live, we have a new high sustainable limit product that I'll dive into more, that also provides us information of what the capability of that resource is based off the weather conditions and the inverters that are available at the system, and to provide it every 12 minutes to give us a better indication of what the potential of that resource will be, knowing that you are dispatching or performing other functions. For CAISO, we provide, it's outdated already. We provide 2 forecast service providers. We provide hourly day-ahead forecasts for every single eligible intermittent resource, which is an EIR, and it goes out 7 days. You can see that on today's Outlook. That was an enhancement that we made a couple years ago to really help with system alerting. Those are updated twice a day. They get updated at 5:30 in the morning, and they also get updated at 8:45 in the morning, that last snapshot right before the day-ahead market and the reliability unit commitment starts running. The real-time forecast, we provide a rolling 8 hours at a 5-minute granularity that updates every 5 minutes. We do have a renewable provider that provides probabilistic forecasts that we use for risk assessment. In addition to that, we also have a new type of resource. These resources change and their forecast changes as you get to real time. So we have a new product that is released that goes in around the afternoon of the day prior. So you're running an update at 8:45 previous day, but we also run an update at around 3:30 in the afternoon as well, so we can see how those have changed. And then we change granularity from an hourly granularity to a 15-minute granularity at that time. Now, where are they used in the CAISO system? And I'll dig into this a little bit more. The forecasting team has the ability to select the active forecast provider. That's the optimization that's happening with the multiple renewables. And we can select an active. We can choose one to provide a day ahead, one to provide a real time. We could choose one to provide a forecast for this resource ID and another to provide a forecast for the other resource ID in the day ahead time frames. the real-time timeframes, but we're also able to do blend configurations of a weighting of 50-50 of each of the vendors if we need it. The hourly forecast is used, the day-ahead hourly forecasts are used in the RUC, the Reliability Unit Commitment process. They're also used for outage coordination and next day study information. The real-time forecasts are used in the market in the real-time dispatch to set what we call the dispatch optimization target, or the DOT, for all of those eligible intermittent resources. And those update every 5 minutes, so it helps feed the market system the latest and greatest forecast for all of the resources every 5 minutes. As I mentioned before, CAISO's created an internal persistent forecast, and we really found there was a lot of benefit in bringing that in-house to improve accuracy of that real-time dispatch timeframe, which is about 10 minutes out from actual. So what is all behind the renewable forecast? So many of us, including the California ISO, do utilize forecast service providers to provide the renewable forecast. For the CAISO, we get those forecasts at a resource ID level, and then we aggregate the forecast up to regions, forecast regions, and then they'll also roll up to CAISO totals, which is what you see when you're looking at OASIS or today's Outlook. Behind the scenes of a renewable forecast, you have the NWP models, right? The National Weather Prediction models that are provided by NOAA or the ECMWF or the UK Met, whichever one you're looking at, right? So you're feeding a weather model in, you're feeding a bunch of data in. So we talked about that in the previous slide. You have weather data coming in, actual weather data. You have wind plant data coming in of what the actuals are. You have solar plant data coming in. And then the vendors take that and they run a model, taking into consideration the make and the model of each resource, the type of it. Is it a solar thermal? Is it co-located? Is it a hybrid? And then also apply some statistics and some statistical adjustments to it. And then they will provide an output product. That output product goes to a human forecaster. That human forecaster can choose which vendor to utilize for each of the resource IDs. And then ultimately, that goes to the power prediction that is there for that resource in all of the different market horizons that we talked about in the previous slide. So what's been changing over time, right? So this has been a process that's been evolving. I think the weather models have been improving. There's many things that have been improving with AI, machine learning, all of those different components that are happening throughout. But what's happening inside of the CAISO and where these renewable forecasts are used? So historically, when FERC 764 went live, you saw that the deterministic renewable resource ID forecasts were used in the market optimization. They were fed to the market, they were given to the market, and they were also there for operational awareness of where there could be deviations from forecast to actual for the operators to be able to visualize. Well, as we progressed over the years, you see that they are starting to be used in many other areas. And one of those areas is you now have another forecast type that's been developing, which is the rooftop solar forecast, that are now feeding into demand forecasting software to help you forecast the demand or the load that's on the system. And that also feeds into the market and also feeds into operational awareness. The other thing that's been happening on the operational awareness side is that you see the need of these forecasts to be used for forecasting for what CAISO calls the net load peak. The net load peak to us, because net load's definition is a little different depending who you talk to, is the demand that we're serving that accounts for the behind the meter solar that's on the system, minus the large scale wind, minus the large scale solar. And one of the things that we've seen as solar penetration in specific has grown in the West is that net peak demand forecast is really critical, but you have to get that forecast by looking at the renewable side of the house. And you really need to look at it in not just an hourly average granularity, but 5-minute granularity. And I'll show you a graph in a second that kind of highlights why that's so important. So it's being used very heavily to not just look at that peak time frame or other hours and just feeding it into the market, but it's used for situational awareness and planning for some of these critical time periods that don't occur at the system demand peak anymore. It's also used for extreme weather forecasting. We see climate have an impact on the energy sector. There's a lot of research going on in that space right now. But in the West, you've seen really, there's many climatic events that we've been experiencing, but extreme heat is one that's prevalent. Fire weather is one that's grown significantly. And then also the atmospheric rivers and the overall impact of the atmospheric rivers are growing. Each one of these elements has a huge impact on the renewable forecasting, but also has an impact on the grid. And renewable forecasting with higher penetrations of renewables and higher renewables serving the load, it's really important that you have those forward out forecasts to the 7-day horizon, as well as granularities less than an hourly average, to really start watching the extreme weather that's coming, but also making sure that you're able to plan for those situations and the reductions that may be coming in the renewable fleet at the same time that you have higher load penetration. Of course, used for communication of renewable uncertainty, and I'll get into somehow the automations of the renewable uncertainty are happening in the uncertainty requirements. Renewable confidence bands, great awareness for the operators. And then one of the things that we really have started monitoring is demand versus supply. So when you get into some of these critical events, it's really important that you watch what your forecasted demand is versus your supply, renewable resources being a critical part of that supply that's forecasted to be there. They're now feeding into uncertainty requirement formulations. So we feed all of the renewable forecasts at different horizons into the flexible ramp product, which we call FRP, and the requirement formulation for FRP. We also feed them into right now what's called RUC uncertainty, so day ahead uncertainty. In the future, it will be called the imbalance reserve requirement, and that's the uncertainty that's in the day ahead time frame as you're starting to plan day ahead and head into real time. We also use them to form the regulation requirement recommendation that is on the system. So during certain conditions, let's say cloudy conditions or partly cloudy conditions, you know that you're going to have higher error between that last market run at that 10-minute time frame to actual, and those forecasts are used to see what that error is going to be and see if you need to take out a little bit more of an insurance policy. So maybe on a normal day, I'm okay covering uncertainty of 95th percentile. But on days where I know that the forecast is going to have some more error and some more challenges and it's going to have some more movement, maybe I want to take an insurance policy out of the 98th percentile to help cover it. And those forecasts, especially the probabilistic ones in nature, which we'll get into, really help form your regulation requirement recommendation as well as some of these other products. What is all going into renewable forecasting? I'm sure a lot of these graphs you guys have seen before, especially if you're meteorologists, but the big input is the renewable forecasting tools, right? So you have a lot of information that's coming to you from the NWP models. And those NWP models can give you information of the cloud cover forecast, different wind forecasts at different heights, which is what you see at the top screen, is a 500 millibar map versus a 700 millibar map. You have now 10-meter forecasts that really came out, knowing that a lot of the wind farms at the time were at that 10-meter level. But then you have new models coming out too that have smoke incorporated in them, which are really key for those of us to have solar, whether that solar be rooftop solar or that solar be on the large scale side. And all of those tools help you create awareness to where there might, one, what's feeding your renewable forecast that you're getting if you're using a forecast service provider. But then it's also creating awareness when you look at the suite of them and how they change over time of the uncertainty that exists within the main input of weather to these models to help you make some of the critical decisions that you need to make for renewable forecasting. The other key tool is monitoring, right? You can forecast it, but then the big piece you have to do is monitor all of the data that's coming in. There is a significant amount of data that is getting managed when you are forecasting for like 600 resource ID on the system. So one of the things that we look at is we always are looking at the multiple providers. There's a lot of graphs on here, and I won't talk about all the graphs on here, but I want to point out that when you have a multiple provider aspect, you are looking at the weather conditions that are there, but then you're also looking at the provider's forecast to see which provider really is going to align better with those weather conditions that are forecasted, and then also take into consider past performance. And that past performance could be the day previous, or that past performance could be what they did last time it was sunny, or what the vendors did last time it was partly cloudy or cloudy. I put a treat on there for you all because I pulled all these graphs during the eclipse time, so you guys can see what the eclipse forecast looks like for the multiple provider approach before we went into the day ahead. With that, you also are monitoring the data behind the scenes. So for us, we have a persistence forecast, and then we have what we call ELFs, which is our forecast system that feeds all of that information in. The ELFs is represented by those that are on the external forecast service provider forecast. We have switch logic that happens with persistence. So for example, if solar is 0, persistence will not be on, so we can capture the sunrise appropriately from a vendor perspective. If you are dispatching for the market and you have supplemental dispatch, we don't want persistence to follow that. Therefore, you would end up on the external forecast service provider. We like to monitor how many resources are on and running off of the persistence forecast feature versus the forecast service provider feature. In addition to that, we have data quality monitoring. Honestly, this is an area that we're expanding over time because data quality is critically important to be able to monitor, because that goes into the forecast creation as well as the historical data set. But we have monitoring on there so we know how many resources have a bad data quality flag, how many of them are missing some key elements, how many are on manual dispatches for us, how many are getting supplementally dispatched at that point in time, what the transitions are looking like if we're switching back and forth on our methods for the RTV timeframe too much. And then all that information comes together just to create awareness of where you need to be prepared, where you have some uncertainty, because if your data quality is not good, it's going to add uncertainty into your forecast creation, and then it also will impact your accuracy overall. All right, a deep dive into the renewable use cases for probabilistic forecast or confidence bands. So this is an area that's been developing quite rapidly, as you all know, over time, and how grid operators and others are using probabilistic forecasting in both the day ahead and real-time timeframes. So we're using this for situational awareness and uncertainty requirement formulations. So in the day ahead timeframe, very similar to some of the other things that we highlighted on the other slide, is we are using it for forward planning and alerting. We use the lower probabilistic forecast band at a 5-minute granularity to feed into our 8-day horizon alerts when we compare demand versus supply, so that we can ensure that we have awareness of how tight we are between that if that lowest confidence band forecast on the renewable side would show itself. We use it in RUC uncertainty and in the RUC side of the process for the California ISO to help inform the operators of what that RUC uncertainty looks like, and they can plan for that in the reliability unit commitment that happens in the day ahead timeframe to set resources up to help cover that uncertainty. Like we discussed earlier, we use it in regulation requirement formulation. How much insurance do we want to take out on a certain day, just because we know the forecasted conditions that are going to be coming, and with looking at all the other tools, we're able to see what uncertainty may exist between the time period of that 10-minute out to real time. And then also we're using it for vendor optimization. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's really important to show what the different scenarios are. In probabilistic forecasting is a wide definition, right? You could use what we call a P90, P10 forecast, or 80-20, but you also see, which we find really useful from the renewable side of the house, the different models. So we know what is the forecast that you've optimized as the vendor, and then what are the forecasts that if you ran on the ECMWF, what would it be? What was the forecast if you ran on the GFS, what it would be? And on lots of weather acronyms out there. But as a forecaster who has meteorologists on the team and you're doing that vendor optimization, you know which model you feel is the most accurate as you go into different situations, whether it be a tropical system hitting the system, or if you see an extreme heat event and pressure gradients moving around. And having that visibility really helps us determine what vendor we should be utilizing in the forward and in the real-time conditions to be able to capture whatever is happening on the weather side. In real time, we use it to create operator awareness of that real-time uncertainty. And then one of the items that we're looking at is incorporating probabilistic forecasts into some of these requirement formulations, whether it be the FRP product or in the imbalance reserve product or in the rock uncertainty process in the future. We see during key situations that there's benefits in incorporating the probabilistic forecasts coming in versus the methodology that we're using now. A lot of them they occur when you are hitting something that's outside the typical day-to-day, such as a hurricane coming or a solar eclipse happening, where you want some of that probabilistic forecast really feeding in. One of the things I want to dive into a little bit more from the previous slide is the system awareness side of things. One of the things that we found really, really critical to help with all of the climatic events that have been happening and impacting the power grid is having a process to look at forecasting awareness and transparency. And probabilistic forecasts are a key part of that alerting mechanism. So you have a group of trained meteorologists that are really looking at the weather conditions that are there up to 365 hours ahead of the event. You're looking at everything. You're looking at the weather and how the weather is forecasted, the uncertainty that's happening in the weather, and then how that weather is going to impact your load and your load uncertainty. And then you're also looking at it in the renewable fleet, in addition to transmission. Transmission has impacts from weather as well. Transmission has impacts in the resource supply as well. And then really developing alerts that look at the difference between the renewable resource supply, which uses the probabilistic forecast, the RA resource supply that's outside of the renewable, and the uncertainty that exists in the RA resource supply, the transmission and the impact to the overall supply against your demand and your demand forecast and your demand forecast uncertainty. So our goal is to balance the two sides of the house. You want to balance the demand against the supply. So really starting to monitor, assess, and alert on key conditions using these probabilistic forecasts is really critical. A couple years ago, we made an enhancement to today's Outlook that started showing that forward forecast on an out basis. So it shows you the demand forecast. It shows you the net demand forecast, which has the wind and solar forecast embedded in it, and then also compares it against the RA supply so you can see when on the system we're getting tight. For example, if you pull it up for today, it's available, you'll see that we're a little tighter on the system. We're in exceptionally warm conditions for October right now. You don't typically have as much RA supply during the system on that because you don't normally hit higher loads, and we're expected to hit around 36,000 megawatts a day, which is in the grand scheme of things of 52,000 a lower load, but it's not a low load for October. So with that, we've created awareness on today's Outlook. Internally, we've created an advanced warning system that is really giving us a feel of what the system health of both the California ISO as well as the West is when you're looking at the weather side of the house, the load side of the house, and the renewable and resource supply. Those alerting mechanisms start within that 8 to 10 day horizon to help us forward plan and be able to account for heat waves, atmospheric river events, cold weather events, hurricanes, all of those different features that we really have seen come and impact the renewables significantly. With that, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about what a lower band process looks like. I could have put the upper bands on here too, but we would have gotten to a whole lot of lines. So with this, red is actual.
Before you go
yeah,
into that, could you try to wrap up within maybe 10 minutes so we leave just a little bit of time for questions?
Yep.
All right, thank you.
No problem. So with that, we have actuals on there. One of the things I want to highlight is within this yellow box. So a lot of us do day ahead forecasting at an hourly average level. The markets run at hourly average levels. What you see here, if you are very solar heavy, is really the critical importance to watching your 5-minute forecast, whether it be in a forward band or in a forward like 8-day horizon, or even as you're looking day ahead to real time. Because the difference, especially in heavy ramp hours, where your hourly forecast would be right here in the middle point, but your 5-minute band forecast is here, you're talking about multiple thousands of megawatts difference in what the day ahead horizon can plan for versus what the real-time horizon is going to see. And you want to capture that when you're looking at the different uncertainties. With that, I'm going to skip a couple slides. I've talked a lot in other forums about the uncertainty requirements that are there. So if you guys have any questions on that, feel free to ask those. But let's dive a little bit into the multiple vendor optimization, which we haven't talked about as much. So one of the things that we look at is we are always looking at the weather conditions, but we're tracking in the accuracy what the different forecasts are in both the day ahead and all of the different real-time time horizons that are critical to us. So it could be the RTD market, it could be the RTPD market, the 15-minute market, the hour ahead market. And then we also are monitoring what the accuracy looks like with different blend configurations that can occur. We do this at a system level, we do this at a regional level, and we have the ability to dig in as well to the resource ID level so that we can look at it every single day when we're forming our forecast and make sure that for the next day and for the real time of that day, that we are on the most accurate vendor going downstream for all of those key horizons. It's not an automated process. There's not an automated calculation happening behind the scenes outside of the blends that we like to look at, but we really are using the expertise of the energy meteorologists to look at what it was performance in sunny conditions and cloudy conditions and partly cloudy conditions, and also they just have a feel of what that weather forecast looks like and what the generation would be in the next day. We currently have 3 renewable forecast service providers. We have 2 for large scale wind, and then we have a provider for behind the meter solar as well as behind the meter actual. One of the improvements that we made back in 2018 that was really critical is putting in a persistent base renewable forecast. And part of the reason it was critical is a lot of the vendors use a persistent forecast in that time frame, but there's a lot of processing time to put all that data together, send that data to them, and then bring that data back. So with that, we built it in-house. We eliminated over 6 minutes of lag time to send it there and back, and that really helped us gain accuracy. We also develop our, what we call reference curves or full sun curves in-house, and we update those reference curves and full sun curves every single day to account for the sun changes. And we found that that daily update also has really helped with the accuracy of the persistent model. This is back. I wanted to put a graph back of 2017 before it was implemented. You saw in the real-time time horizon, this is RTD, about 10 minutes out, you saw that the forecast, especially during the more variable season, was seeing 3 to 4% error before persistence was put in place. The first round of persistence was put in place in April, and you halved the error. And then when you look at also what happened, we put enhancements and you got the error to 1%. So we saw large benefits in putting the error in. All right, let's talk a little bit about the resource evolution. and then I will wrap up and make sure we have time for some questions. In California, we've seen significant growth in storage resources over time. These are the graphs from summer of the dispatch of those solar resources. You can see, during some of the peak times in July and August, we are dispatching up to 4,000 megawatts of solar onto the system. And you can kind of see what their profile looks like. It really follows, the overall net load profile of the system. We have two resource types. And one of the things to note is when you look at the queue, you are expected to see 11,500 megawatts of renewable coupled by storage by 2026. That was a survey that was done back in January of 2023. Hybrid resources for us is that you have one resource ID, and underneath that one resource ID, you can have a solar and battery resource. A co-located resource is when you have two resource IDs, one resource ID for the solar and one resource ID for the battery, so that they can optimize independently of each other, but you do have a point of interconnection limit, or a POI that we have, that says, okay, most of the time you're oversized. So in the example you see there, solar is 100 megawatts and the battery 50, so it totals to 150. The market knows that you two are connected at an aggregated capability constraint, and that your limit cannot go over 100 megawatts. But it allows you the dispatch capability of the two of them independently. And this is the one that allows persistent forecasting to still be activated for. The new data point that was added was the high sustainable limit. So this overall is to capture the instantaneous generating capability of the variable energy resource, looking at the inverters, the weather conditions that are there. So essentially, what is the resource able to produce without any market signal? As we grow on renewables, these renewables are starting to provide and are providing more market services, which is great. But for a forecaster, it's really critical that you have availability to see what that resource would have produced if it was not following a market signal. And why do you need that? You need that because you need to train your model. So if you're marking out a significant amount of data every single day because that resource is dispatching, then the models don't have very many data points to train off of, and it creates instability in the model overall. So you want that to help increase the number of data points, the more relationships you can form for that resource, and ultimately provide a better forecast. It also allows in the enhancement that we can feed that HSL point into persistence instead of turning persistence off. So right now in the current structure, you can't follow telemetry if that resource is moving for market purposes. So instead, we are now able to use HSL and instead of turning it completely to the external forecast service provider, which has benefits in forecast accuracy in that more near time period. With that, I'm going to skip a couple so we have time for questions. And I'm going to leave us with this graph because I find it very interesting. This was April of 2023. This is a day that we starve 108% of our energy by non-carbon resources. Note this is non-carbon, not just renewables. But I think it's good to see what the resource mix overall is doing, where the batteries are charging, where the curtailments are happening, how the exports look and imports. With that, I will pass it back to you, Julia, for any questions.
Well, there are tons of questions. Thanks so much, Amber. It's obviously a very interesting topic. So the first question, it's the first and the third, so I'll ask together. How important it is to forecast, for the forecast to capture when a ramp event happens versus its magnitude?
So what is so what event is happening versus the magnitude of the event?
When it's happening versus the magnitude.
When versus the magnitude. I think it's, as a forecaster, I think we're always going to say both, right? It's important to see both. I think that one of the things that's helpful, and I'll take an example from when we were planning for the remnants of the hurricane that hit San Diego earlier this year, is at that point in time, the awareness of the when really helped us be able to set resources up, as well as the uncertainty requirements, to handle the fact that you didn't quite know the full magnitude of what it would do. We knew that there was going to be clouds. We knew there was going to be partly clouded clouds. We knew there was going to be a lot of rainfall. We had a really good feeling of when that event was going to happen. And what happens when you know the when a little bit more is that you can lean on those uncertainty requirement products to help you mitigate not completely knowing the magnitude. But I will caveat, knowing the magnitude is also important, because if you look at the eclipse, which is a totally different forecasting event, the magnitude in that event is important because you need to be able to prepare for the ramp rate that is going to occur on the system. So I'd say they are both important, but I do say that the when helps you as a system operator be able to plan and use other tools in your toolbox to be able to be prepared to handle the magnitudes.
Got it. Thank you. The next question is, how are you using probabilistic forecasts for resource adequacy and risk assessment?
Yes, so I'll speak a little bit about the use of the probabilistic forecast. So you have a resource adequacy number for your solar fleet as well as your wind fleet. What we've done in our forward alerting process is remove the resource adequacy numbers in the RA side so that we can see what the lowest probabilistic forecast is and plug it in. So we take the new information of that event that's coming up in the next 8 days, and we use the probabilistic information to take the resource adequacy numbers out and start putting operational numbers in. The other thing that we're starting to look at a lot is the non-renewable RA supply and the uncertainty that is sitting around that non-RA supply during these extreme climate events. There's a lot of research happening there. There's a lot of great data that's coming out of that, but you see impacts of these extreme events to the availability and the performance of the other non-RA supplies. So you're going to see some more modeling efforts in that area.
Thank you. How do you present uncertainty to operators?
Yeah, that is a good question. So all the graphs that you saw going through, we do not show the operators unless they want to share screen with us and we want to brief them in some way. Those are tools that the forecasting team at the California ISO has. We do show our operators confidence bands. So some of the graphs I didn't get a chance to get to, we will give them confidence bands on the load side. We'll give them confidence bands on the renewable side when we're going through critical system events and they're planning for some key time periods. So we will give them the band. We just don't give them all of the products that are out there. And then at the end, the big important thing when you're doing uncertainty forecasting is you have to do it at the net load. If you do it at the aggregate of all the components that are there, you may be looking at them as a forecaster because they're important to be able to see, but you need to look at what it would be on a net load perspective, or you're not going to cover enough in some areas and you're going to cover too much in other areas. So we give that information to the operators, but mostly it's a very open dialogue, whether it be the CAISO operators or any of the WEIM operators, what we're seeing to be able to give them some of that information and help guide them.
Right. Thank you, Amber. I'll ask, I think, one more question and then we'll wrap up. What is the average error magnitude for these forecasts? What events, conditions can drive higher error?
Yeah, so I could go back. So I'm going to go back to the RTD slide because I have that in here, and these are our last error updates that we're seeing. So our latest real-time forecast accuracy from 21 to 23, and in the 10-minute out forecast, you see that we're averaging, between 1.2 to 1.4% error. We have seen some increases in 2023, that we're looking at, but this is MAPE error. So when you look at error, you have to also look at your actuals. Are your actuals of good quality and impacting the error, or is there an impact from those actuals as well as weather forecast that could be impacting them overall? For us, in the California side of things, we see, because we are so solar heavy, both on the load side as well as the renewable side, that when we are in our rainy season, we have higher error on the renewables, because that's just a harder event to be able to forecast for. We also see higher error when tule fog shows up, because that burn off rate is really hard to forecast. Same with the marine layer, but because the larger scale solar resources typically are more in the valley area, that tule fog can have a big impact on us as well. So the winter season is where the renewables typically have more error on them.
Great. So maybe I'll actually ask one or two more. How do intermittent resources offer into California ISO? For example, are these price-based offers, self-schedules, etc.? And how are these forecasts incorporated in those offers?
Yeah, so for the California ISO, and I'm going to speak to the real-time just because it's the easiest market, the resources, the majority of them economically offer in. There are still some self-schedules, but it's really in percentages small offering into the California ISO market. So we see them economically offer in, and then when they economically offer in for the CAISO BAA, the forecast is generated by the CAISO team from these metrics, and then that goes into the market optimization every 5 minutes, and it forms the dispatch optimization target. So it's directly fed for every single resource ID into the market software to form the dispatch optimization target. And then the market is looking at it if it needs to dispatch the resource or not, and then that would show up in the DOT as well. But it starts with the formulation of the forecast before the DOT is formed.
Okay, so really last one then. What kind of intervention is the human step in the process chain? Can you detail or make an example?
I mean, the human's involved in the whole process, as you saw through some of the other slides, right? I mean, that the human starts with the meteorological conditions that are there, and those meteorological conditions help inform the uncertainty that exists. It helps inform the optimization of the multiple vendors, which vendor we're on, for what time period, for what set of resources. So the human is really there to be able to look at the weather, take that weather, and make sure that we're on the most accurate forecast that we can have. And then if there's uncertainty, which there is, on top of it, to help inform the uncertainty product and the amount of insurance we need to take out in a given day. Do we need a different confidence interval for regulation to be able to handle that? And those are all driven from analysis from the human perspective. And then they would be able to change the vendor or change the insurance policy that we're using in the percentiles that we have.
All right. Thank you, Amber. So we're about at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap up here. Amber, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. I know everybody learned a few things, and I definitely learned a lot. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll get the responses to your unanswered questions posted as quickly as possible. We appreciate your engagement, and if you would like to stay engaged, I would invite you to participate in the next G-PST ESIG webinar on November 20th, where Mark Norton from Smart Wires will be talking about European experience with generation interconnection. Further information on all of ESIG webinars can be found on our website at www.esig.energy under events, and you're all invited to attend and information on all G-PST webinars can also be found at www.globalpst.org. Sorry, www.globalpst.org. I also hope to see many of you next week at ESIG Full Technical Workshop in San Diego, California, in Kaiso's backyard, where we will continue discussing the latest advancements on the topics related to energy transition. Amber, I want to thank you once again for this very timely webinar, and thank you all for your interest and for your great questions. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future. And in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. Bye now.